last time they brought me here, it was 2001, and my first book had just come out. And, you know, I love coming to Seattle. It always feels like coming home when I come here. And I think back, and I think, you know, we've come a long way since 2001, most of it straight down. You know? I mean, you think, okay, so we had Hurricane Katrina, we had hurricane in financial markets, melting glaciers, melting futures for young people, you name it, we've had it. You know, but there's one thing that I think has changed for the better, and I think that is the willingness and the readiness to begin having more radical conversations about the nature of our economy. I mean, I remember when Occupy Wall Street happened, I would hear people in the grocery store, in grocery lines, you know, talking about it. So I think that's a good thing. And that's what I want to talk about tonight. I want to talk about what a fundamentally different kind of economy might look like. And so I'll start with my own personal story, my own personal journey. I started this work back in 1987. I think I've known David just about that long. And I started a magazine called Business Ethics, back when, you know, that phrase used to mean something, or I thought it did. And, you know, over 20 years, I watched, you know, business schools actually do teach ethics, believe it or not. This was something that I saw rise up. I saw socially responsible investing. I saw corporate social responsibility. All these things were becoming industries. And yet business was becoming more and more ruthless. You know, it used to be you only laid off people if a company was at death's door. And then layoffs became just business as usual. I saw companies that I admired hire union-busting consultants, outsourcing jobs, you know, lobbying quadrupled. So all these things. And I began asking myself, you know, what is going on here? And I realized that it really came down to one thing. And that is the core purpose and design of companies. That all this supposedly good stuff is just barnacles on the side of the whale. And really it doesn't penetrate to the DNA. You know, that's the purpose, it's the design of companies. So, you know, when we try to change this model from the outside, it's like trying to put picket fences in front of a speeding locomotive. It just flattens it. So I became interested in this issue of design. How would you design companies differently and an economy differently? And so when I was writing my new books called Owning Our Future, I journeyed around. I said, you know, where are the kinds of enterprises that really are fundamentally different, both in the U.S. and in Europe? And what I saw, I saw an unseen economic revolution rising around the globe. It's astonishing how widespread it is, how robust it is, how sophisticated it is, and it's virtually invisible, I think, to many of us. Now, it's not about capitalism as we know it or socialism as we know it. It's about grounding an economy in a fundamentally different kind of social architecture. I mean, social architecture is about how do we organize ourselves to do things. And in an economy, it's about economic and financial design. And so this different kind of economy that I'm seeing, it's one that tends to create beneficial rather than harmful outcomes. It's a living economy and has a built-in tendency to be sustainable. So now, you know, we sometimes call this the new economy, which is kind of a loose term for kind of a loose collection of things. In my book, I use the term generative economy, and I mean that very precisely. It's an economy that's designed to generate the conditions for life. That is its purpose. And now, there's a lot of changes that we need to get us to a new economy. Political, I mean, regulatory, cultural, changes in our personal value system. But there is this key element that we're not talking about enough, and it's ownership design. And what I saw over 20 years at Business Ethics and in some subsequent work at TELUS Institute, where I'm a fellow now, I saw, as one of my colleagues put it, he said, ownership is the original system condition. You know, it's where wealth is created. It determines who gets that wealth. It determines who controls the economy. So the dominant form in our economy, as David has told us so well, you know, when corporations rule the world, this dominant form, I think, also deserves a name. I call it extractive. It's about extracting maximum financial wealth. And so it's useful, I think, to think of these two kinds of models and begin to look with that lens. And so this is what I do in my book. So let me give you a few examples. I traveled to Denmark, and when you come into Copenhagen Harbor, you know, you fly over. There's about a dozen windmills standing in the harbor. This is Lynetten Wind Farm. Has anybody been there? Anybody seen this? It's a wonderful site. I still kind of get thrilled by windmills. And it turns out that half of these are owned by a municipal utility, and half are owned by a wind guild. Now, a wind guild is a form where individual, relatively small investors will come together and pool their money to start wind farms. This happened in Denmark. And it's very widely credited, the whole wind movement in Denmark is widely credited to these wind guilds, that they really jump-started it. And Denmark today produces 20% of its electricity from wind. It's more than any other nation. And it was citizens getting together as investors who jump-started that. So banking, I'll just run a couple of things here, run through a few examples. I sat down and I visited with Bill Howard, who's the CEO of a bank down the street from my house. It's a little bank. They have 4 branches. It's called Beverly Cooperative. And it's where I do my own banking. And Bill told me, he said, you know, I've got 800 mortgages out there, and in the last 3 years, fewer than 5 have gone bad. And he said, you know, the reason is that we know our community. We're chartered to serve our community. This is a cooperative bank. It doesn't have shareholders. It's owned by the people who bank there. Its mission in its charter is to serve its community, and lo and behold, it does. He says, you know, I don't want to go public, because if you go public, if you trade on Wall Street, then you have to serve shareholders, and it's a different model. So, you know, it turns out that there's a lot of banks that did not get us in trouble. Credit unions, cooperative banks, community banks, which are small and locally owned. In my book, I talk about research showing that, you know, these banks didn't do the shenanigans. They held together relatively well in the crisis. And yet, here's the thing. We have these new banking regulations coming down, particularly capital requirements, that are crushing these small banks. Because, you know, the big banks created the problem, and yet the remedies are being applied across the board. So these little banks, I mean, Bill Howard was talking about the big checks he has to write, you know, into his capital reserve. And it's because we don't see the difference. We don't recognize that there are generative designs and there are extractive designs, and there's a difference. And because we don't see that, we're regulating banks in a way that is crushing. Bill said to me, we have about 7,000 banks today. In 5 or 10 years, we'll have 5,000. And there's going to be a lot of these little banks are going to go out of business because we don't see them. We don't see that they're different, and it's not just about size. You know, we often talk about small and local, and that is a pretty good shorthand for the kind of economy I'm talking about. But it's different. It's more nuanced than that. In Northern Europe, I discovered that foundation-controlled companies are really quite common. IKEA is one. I went and visited Novo Nordisk, which is a pharmaceutical. Now, this is a multi-billion-dollar company. It's traded on public stock markets. So you and I, if we had any money, could go invest in it. And yet, it's controlled by a foundation. And the purpose of this company is to defeat diabetes. It's out on the west coast of Denmark. I drove out there. My little GPS guiding me, because the signs in Denmark are terrible. But, so I got there, and you know, Kalundborg is apparently, it's this town, it turns out, is held up around the world as a model of industrial symbiosis. In this town, you have one company, its waste becomes food for another company. You have waste heat from the power plant is piped along and used to heat homes. And at Novo Nordisk, when you make insulin, what you have left over is a bunch of yeast that they then treat and they give it to the farmers and it's spread on the fields. Now, so this kind of industrial symbiosis is possible because there is a stable ownership design. There's not some venture capitalist or, you know, God forbid, Mitt Romney coming in, buying up this company, you know, layering on debt, moving the headquarters, none of that. It's controlled by a foundation. Every year, this foundation makes the executives come and report to them and say, how did you carry out your social mission? How did you carry out your ecological mission, in addition to your financial mission? So in London, I visited a fascinating company called the John Lewis Partnership. Now, because people told me, you know, you got to find some big companies. Can this work at scale? Is just about mom and pop companies, or is it about, you know, something else? So I found this fabulous company, John Lewis Partnership. It's the largest department store chain in the United Kingdom. It's billions of dollars in sales. It has 272 grocery stores and 35 department stores. It has more revenue than Monsanto. And it's 100% owned by its employees. And the purpose, this is the most wonderful piece, the purpose of this company is to serve employee happiness. And they actually say that. If you go onto their website, you'll see this. And I thought, well, you know, can this be real? And so I flew over there. I had some other business in London, so I went and I saw this company. And they actually have a bicameral governance design where employees directly elect a partnership council. And that council appoints about a third of the board. And I met a butcher there named John who was wearing a white fedora and a tie. I'd never met a butcher before who wore a tie. And he talked about his sister had cancer, and this company, she worked there too, and the company said to her, well, we'll keep your job. We'll keep your job. And they had a little pocket of money that a committee of employees controlled, and they were able to give her some financial assistance because she needed it. And I thought, you know, it's an extraordinary, it's just a department store. You know what I mean? It's not going to solve the problem of growth. There's a lot of things wrong with this company, but it seemed to take seriously its mission of employee happiness. And in fact, every year, 40 to 60% of profits are given out in bonuses to employees. And they also have pensions. So pretty remarkable company, and there it is, just competing along with every other, you know, department store and grocery store. A few more, just cooperatives. Cooperatives are, I think, the oldest and most highly evolved of all the generative ownership designs I've seen out there. And I drove to rural Wisconsin and I visited Organic Valley. This is a company, has about 700 million in sales. It's owned by the 1,700 organic family farms that make its dairy, cheese, and eggs. And I sat down with George Seaman, who's a wonderful man. He's a farmer. He's got a ponytail down his back, and he was wearing jeans and, you know, Dockers with no socks, and slipped his shoes off when we were talking. A real guy. And he was one of the farmers who formed this company, and their purpose was to save the family farm. That's what they wanted to do. And they've done a pretty good job of it. Now, I call this company nationally local, which I think is an interesting distinction, because if you buy Organic Valley milk here, it would be, you would know it was from this region. If I buy Organic Valley milk in Boston, it's from New England. And the reason is that they organized production and distribution into regional pools. And that reduces trucking costs and so forth. But also, the company, the farmers enjoy a national brand. So it's national when it needs to be, and it's local when it needs to be. Now, most agricultural companies like this aim to pay their farmers, their suppliers, as little as possible. Organic Valley aims to pay its suppliers as much as possible. And that's because of its ownership design. George said to me, he said, you know, I don't really want profit much over about 2%. I'll just have to pay taxes on it. I'd rather give it to the farmers. So because the way that this company is designed, the way that it's owned, what its purpose is, it's trying to pay farmers as much as possible. You know, that you can design that into a company the same way that you can design in profit maximization for shareholders. So what I want to suggest, and I won't be here too much longer because I want to talk and get David up here, but I just want to suggest that these various models, and there are others that I talk about in the book, they really form a coherent single family of design. And generative design is what I call it. I think it needs a name. They have 5 design elements in common that I'll just run through quickly. The first is purpose. They all have a living purpose. It might be to save the family farm, create green energy, make life-saving medicine. But they have some kind of purpose of creating the conditions for life to thrive. Now, purpose doesn't do it by itself. What turns it into a design is at least one other element that holds that purpose in place. And so a second element is membership, what we often call ownership. You know, who has a right to vote for the board? Who has a right to a cut of profits? I mean, this is what we call ownership. So you know, traditional companies are about absentee ownership. We know that one well. Generative design is about rooted membership. People, it's ownership held in human hands. A third element is governance. You know, extractive design is governance by markets. Generative design has mission-controlled governance. So you have the foundation there, or you have a board of farmers, you know, adhering to a mission. A fourth element is finance. How do you get capital into these things? You know, casino finance is how traditional companies run. With generative design, you have stakeholder finance, where capital becomes a friend rather than a master. And finally, I'd say there are networks, because no company stands alone. So you need, you know, traditional companies have commodity networks. You trade goods based on price. But generative design has ethical networks. So it might be organic standards. It might be the worldwide network of cooperatives. Now, I think that vision is important. I think, you know, a lot of us live with what they call the TINA school of thought. There is no alternative to capitalism as we know it. And so I think recognizing that there actually is an alternative is a start. How you get there is a very large question. I'm not going to solve that in the next 2 minutes here. You know, in a lot of things we'll need rechartering companies. You know, maybe we need to get profit maximizing companies out of certain sectors, like education. Nobody should be profit maximizing on the back of students. Nobody should be profit maximizing on hospitals or healthcare at all. You know, so if we could maybe get them out of certain, what was that one? Yeah, corrections. Yeah, you know, getting out of certain sectors and begin to establish the idea that profit maximizing is a dangerous model. And you can't do this everywhere. You know, I think we could begin establishing this principle. So there's a lot of approaches that we'll need to get from here to there, and I won't go too much into that. I'll just say a couple of things I think that we can do. I think we can move our money, you know, get out of Bank America and find our own little local banks that we can bank with. We can invest with our values. Community loan funds, I'm a huge fan of. There are plenty of good social investment advisors who can help us make choices. I think reading and encouraging others to read is huge. You know, this is how we begin to see that something else is possible. We begin to see, no, we really can run a sophisticated, modern economy at large scale by a completely different set of principles. It can be done. And fourth, you know, we can think about where we're buying. I think we know about buy local. We know about farmers markets. You know, we also pay attention to ownership. I mean, there are a lot of dairy cooperatives out there. You can buy coffee from Equal Exchange, which is an employee-owned cooperative, and so forth. So, I think what we're doing with this work is we're creating the mold into which the future can flow. Now, a lot of people will say this stuff is small, it's marginal, but they would have said the same thing 40 years ago about the conservative economic principles that today pretty much run our economy. The difference is that we're building an economy, and not one that's going to last a few decades and then blow us all up. We're building an economy that will last for generations and that can sustain life on this planet for many generations to come. Because what we're talking about really, and I really do firmly believe this, is that it is a more effective, a more resilient, and more sustainable way to run an economy. So I want to close, I want to paraphrase something that Milton Friedman said back in his early marginal days when he was assuring people our day will come. So that wonderful song we heard tonight. He said that, in the meanwhile, what our job is to develop alternatives, to keep them alive, and to keep them available until the economically impossible becomes the economically inevitable. I do think that day will come. So thanks.
My role here tonight is to celebrate Marjorie and her book, and to just fill in a little bit to reinforce what she's doing, and engage in a conversation. Now, Marjorie already knows what I think of her book, because she did me the honor of asking me to write the foreword for it. And so I have used words like brilliant, the best book on ownership ever written, and so beautifully written with such a beautiful message that I literally cried when I was reading it. Now, I do endorsements for a lot of books, but I rarely use...
Very sweet.
I rarely use that kind of language. And one key to what makes it such a special book, and I can say this because I come out of an academic background, Marjorie's background is journalism. And she writes as a true professional journalist, seeking the truth and communicating the message and the story as she sees it. So it's a quality of writing that you rarely see in books of this depth and seriousness. So I urge everybody to get a copy. Her framing of generative versus extractive economies and ownership is also an absolutely brilliant frame. She specifically noted, generate the conditions for life. Now, and she mentioned the term living economies. This is a deeply profound concept. We have created economies around the foundational value of money. The goal of our economy, the goal of business is to make money. Now, if you think about what money actually is, which is nothing but a number, an accounting entry, that, of course, is an act of insanity. We're living beings. The real purpose of the economy is to serve life. And if we want an economy that serves life, we need to start out by understanding how life organizes. So how does life organize? How does the biosphere organize? It is locally rooted everywhere. Locally rooted everywhere. So this ties in exactly with Marjorie's framework. The Wall Street system operates somewhere out there in cyberspace. Nothing but bits and bytes. It is totally delinked from place, from community, from people, from the life of the earth. Perhaps the least or the most neglected issue among progressive movements is the issue of ownership, and exactly what Marjorie is spelling out. because it is the difference between ownership that's pushing through computers. I mean, this extraordinary thing that, you know, some 70 to 80% now of the trading of shares in Wall Street is done by computers in microseconds. Now, what does this have to do with anything? But that is the absolute ultimate extreme of rooted ownership in real people, in real communities who bring their values to bear in every decision that the business makes. Life-centered values. So this is the transition. This is the revolution that Marjorie's talking about. Now, I actually want to mention, you know, you're all familiar that, you know, Karl Marx was an advocate of worker ownership. How many of you are aware that Adam Smith was also an advocate of worker ownership? We're not taught that, but if you actually read The Wealth of Nations, Adam Smith was very skeptical of any business that was larger than one person because he was afraid there'd be monopolistic powers. You know, a real market has absolutely no monopoly power. But his ideal was a firm in which the same person was the owner, the worker, and the manager. Now, our current equivalent of that on a larger scale is the cooperative form of enterprise, which is at the center of Marjorie's conversation. How many of you here are members of a cooperative of some kind? Credit union? Excellent. How many here are members of a union? Excellent. Yeah. These are the two foundational points for moving ahead on a large scale to implement what Marjorie is writing about. And if any of you are interested in this, you absolutely have to get her book, and you absolutely have to read it because it is just filled with ideas of how we do this on scale. And, you know, we're going to engage in a conversation, but before I do that, I want to call on my friend back here, Bill Messenger, who is with the Washington State Labor Council. One of the things that's happening in the labor movement, you know, for years some of us have been saying that if there's a future in the labor movement, it is in worker ownership. You know, instead of negotiating with the owners, be the owners. And that idea is catching on, and Bill is the point person on that for the Washington State Labor Council, which is picking up on this with what looks like it could become a vengeance. It has me absolutely thrilled, and I wanted to give Bill a chance to say a couple of words about what they're thinking about, and then I want you to respond, Marjorie.
You know, co-ops have been around for a while, and we're not strangers to the idea of co-ops, but one of the fascinating arguments that David's made, the first question I asked David was, is there a place for unions in a co-op? Because my history is 30 years pulp and paper. Worked in a powerhouse most of my life. Been a union president for 8 years of that, and I've always worked against the extractive economy. I mean, I know exactly what you're talking about, what you can squeeze out of the turnip. So I've always had that, you know, blunt force attitude towards corporations. I mean, we were trying to be middle class, they were trying to make us lower class. So the co-op idea is fascinating to me, to where you can take, you know, each employee have an equal say. You have to have a manager. We understand you have to have a manager, but not so greedily that they're making so much more money than anybody else that, you know, you just resent that after a while. So I was trying to figure out from David and Michael Peck where unions played into this, because it has always been my impression that if you get along well with your employee, indeed, if you are the employer, why would you need a union? Because I've always had that relationship with the company. They pointed out there's really 3 things that a union can bring to the party. And that's we already have a trust, a health and welfare benefit trust. And maybe someday that'll be obsolete, but right now it's not. We have a pension system. And I believe in pensions more than 401ks. And that's one thing I and David are right on board. 401ks buy you into the problem. And we bring political clout, especially in a blue state. We bring political clout to the table, and one of the things Michael Peck mentioned was, in a co-op you never see your state legislatures, come to the Washington State Labor Council functions. They're always there. So I'm excited.
Okay, this is the early stage of labor unions potentially on major scale beginning to look at how they could play a role in changing the whole leadership or whole ownership configuration in the country. So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, Marjorie.
Yeah, I think it's terribly exciting. I think that labor has traditionally been the bulwark against a takeover by the right. And there's no, it's no secret why there's been a war on labor, I think. And so I think for labor to begin claiming real power, as you said, instead of negotiating, instead of negotiating with owners, be the owners, and yet retain the benefits of labor, because I think they're probably, collective bargaining might still have a place too, and you mentioned other I think, benefits that labor brings. So I think if these forces could be combined, the potential is huge. It was interesting when David asked who here is a member of cooperatives, and pretty much every hand in the room went up. Cooperatives worldwide employ more people than all multinationals combined. And there are some cooperatives are extremely large. Two-thirds of the agricultural production in this country is handled by cooperatives. And it's true in history that society tends to turn to cooperatives in times of trouble. Credit unions were created in the 1930s because we needed to get banking to serve ordinary people. And this is why the whole credit union system was created, and there are millions of credit unions today. The very first cooperative in England was created during the Industrial Revolution by craftspeople who were being pushed out of their trades and couldn't afford to buy food and banded together so they could buy food. So I think a cooperative movement, this is the year of the cooperative, so I'm a huge fan of cooperatives. I think there's a lot more potential there. Apparently they're being formed rapidly right now, I'm being told. And I think that the labor cooperative marriage, I think, is a brilliant one. I think that we could really see some exciting things happen.
Now, as the unions take this on, what could they learn from your book that will be useful to them?
Well, that's an interesting question. Yeah, I think the 5 elements of design they're very simple, and they just give us a handle on how do you think about this question. There have been times when labor got ownership, employees got ownership, and it didn't work out. It was United Airlines, I think, was the classic example. They neglected purpose, they neglected governance. If you don't change the purpose, you haven't really changed anything. So, and that's not a simple thing to do. But how do you get finance into a business? I know that a number of cooperatives are working on. There's a cooperative equity fund that's in formation right now. You can have multi-stakeholder cooperatives. I mean, a cooperative is traditionally owned by the people it serves. So shareholders, customers own a cooperative bank. Or you have farmers own a producer cooperative. So traditionally there's one class of member. But you can have multi-members. So you can maybe have an employee-owned cooperative that would also have investors. They would be a separate class. You could begin to get capital in. Organic Valley does this, for example. So how do you get capital in? How do you focus on purpose? Who should be on the board? How do they get there? These are the kinds of design questions that can lead you to say, the more we can get these questions right, the more we'll begin to get the outcome that we want. There's no silver bullet.
Yeah, I think that's a good, when you get out into the details of the structure of these organizations, it can get very complex, and Marjorie deals with that beautifully in terms of different forms, different approaches to think that through. Now, I also want to call attention, I note my friends Mark Dorkin and Melissa Young in the back here, they have just finished an amazing documentary called Shift Change, which is on the cooperatives movement and how it's developing, many of the same subjects as Marjorie's book, and also bringing in the experience of the Mondragon cooperatives as a very large-scale success story. Could you just say where your documentary is going to be available? Where is it going to be shown that people can put it on their calendar?
So we're going to show it for the very first time in Oakland next week.
Excellent.
We finished on Monday. But the film is going to go many other places. There are already places scheduled in Boston, Maine, Pennsylvania.
One of the things I've become very conscious of talking to leaders of the co-op movement, including I spoke a couple of years ago to the Association of Cooperatives Educators. The leaders were very concerned and upset that there are those, those huge, impressive numbers of cooperatives and cooperative members. But in their view, and others I've talked to in the cooperative movement, most of these cooperatives have pretty much lost sight of what it means to be a cooperative, that there's anything different between a cooperative and the kind of, an ordinary business. And one of the, two issues. One is, how do we reawaken the sense of the value, the distinctive value of a cooperative form of organization? And what have you learned from your case studies in terms of the successful case examples? What have they learned about how to keep that vision at the forefront of both management and the members so that they absolutely do play it out in the ideal way that you described?
That's a really great question. And the first thing I would say, I think, is that I think generative design can drift toward the mediocre in the same way that democracy can. I mean, democracy is a wonderful ideal. I think, and there are many. I think I'm a great fan of the Constitution. I think it's one of the most brilliant pieces of social architecture ever put together. And yet, we often lose the spirit of democracy, and it needs to be continually revived. So I think the same is true. Even if we do reclaim our economy, there's an ongoing challenge of how do you keep a spirit alive. And so one of the things I like about cooperatives is it's the only design I've found that is based on a clear set of articulated ethical principles. There are 10, they're called the Rochdale Principles. They were articulated back in the 1800s by the Rochdale pioneers who created the cooperative form, and they're still used today. In fact, there was a conference about a year ago. Cooperatives had a conference, and they focused on the principles. It's interesting how principles seem so ethereal, and yet I think they are the touchstone that we return to again and again. And I think our economy, we need an economy based on ethical principles. And I couldn't sit here and tell you what all the 10 are. I know it's cooperation among cooperatives, and I think limited return on capital, I think might be one of the principles. I forget what they all are. Equality among members, there's various ones. But so I think a return to the principles, I think.
How do you do that?
Well,
I mean,
okay, so
that's an abstract concept.
Where are organizations? I mean, social architecture is an interesting concept. How do you keep people organized through time with some coherence to principles? And I think, I think 12-step programs are a very good example of an ethically based, very coherent social architecture. There's nobody in charge of 12-step programs. There's no, executive, and yet these things cohere through time. And why do they cohere? They cohere because, you read the principles, you read the 12 steps. You know what I mean? So there's a reiteration of principles. So I think there's that. I think there's also celebration. I think there's celebration is a real key part of human nature.
But take one of your cases.
All right.
And say something about how does the best of the cooperatives, how do they maintain this sense? Do they do educational programs? Do they have special communication programs to their members? One of the ideas in the worker initiative, or the union initiative, is the idea of in addition to the board of directors, a kind of workers' council that regularly meets with management, and its primary function is a line of communication from the workers continuously raising the values question.
Yeah, I do think, so you need structure, you need formal structure, you need ritual, you need celebration, you need culture, all of these things. You need leadership. I mean, I asked Bill Howard, you know, I talked about Bill Howard at Beverly Cooperative Bank. This is a cooperative bank. It turns out there used to be a lot more cooperative banks in this country. A lot of them went public. The executives sold shares into the public markets and pocketed a lot for themselves along the way.
Most of our health insurance companies, weren't they also cooperatives or mutuals at one time?
Yeah,
and then they sold off and pocketed the money.
Right, there's been a whole wave of demutualization. Most of us haven't even noticed because we don't think of ownership. We don't think of it as something that matters. But I asked him, I said, Bill, would you consider going public? And he said, no, I wouldn't. I'm not interested in that, because he said it creates a different kind of company. So I think in that case, leadership is important, because Bill Howard is not interested in maximizing his own income. So who you put in leadership positions, I think, really matters. You know, I have seen, I want to just emphasize this question of ritual and celebration, which is not things we usually think about with business. But I know that Organic Valley has an annual stockholders meeting, because they have preferred shares. They have stockholders with a different kind of stock. They have it at the Kickapoo County Fair. You know, that's a different kind of stockholders meeting. Let's go to the Kickapoo County Fair and get together with our other shareholders of Organic Valley, you know, because they're pretty much all local. Most of their investors are, so they can actually get together. There's another company, now this was not a cooperative, but it was a company that was very mission-driven in Minneapolis. It was another Medtronic. It was a medical devices company. Very, very values-based. And they invited me one time to their annual Christmas party. The founder was still in place. Often when the founder leaves is when you get in trouble. So it's a key danger point. But so I went to this Christmas party at this medical devices company. They made pacemakers and things. Well, the guests of honor at Medtronic's Christmas party were people whose lives had been saved by Medtronic products. And so people who, I'm getting goosebumps even when I talk about it now, people who stood on an assembly line all year round, you know, got to hear about the little 13-year-old who had a pacemaker that she named Phoebe, and that pacemaker, you know, had not had its leads replaced in 5 years, you know, and this gasp went through the crowd, you know, leads that last so long, you know. So these people got a reminder, a very vivid reminder, that they were not in the business of assembling things on an assembly line. They were in the business of saving lives. That was what their work was about, you know. And so how do you keep something like that alive? I mean, I think every company has to ask itself, well, what is the business that we're actually in? And how do we celebrate that? How do we remind ourselves? What kind of rituals can we create to remind ourselves?
You know, I love the example of holding the shareholders meeting at the fair.
Yeah.
Because what it brings to mind is that at a very foundational level, what this is all about is rebuilding community.
Yeah.
You know, again, if you think about what's been happening in our economy, we've simply been monetizing more and more of our human relationships. So instead of interrelating based on caring relationships, it's all a financial transaction. And in our conventional work lives, we're just labor, a commodity for hire for so long as it is convenient to the business. And part of building a living economy is an economy of community, of relationships, and demonetizing those relationships. So, you know, real parties. I mean, yeah. Many of you know I'm involved with the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, and you know, engaging this kind of thinking at the community level. And one of the things I've realized is the most important skill of a Bali organizer in a community is the ability to throw a good street party. So that's about building community. But it's stunning to me, if we just started with the amazing number of cooperative businesses that already exist, so you don't really have to restructure them. You simply need to reactivate the sense of what it means to be a cooperative and what it means to be a very different kind of business. Now, if we combine with that the unions using their incredible political power, but also their financial power of their pension funds and their insurance programs, which are, you know, one place where you can get honest insurance, and they begin to mobilize around buying back the companies that that have taken over. And if combined with that, those of us who have savings or who actually, you know, titularly are owners of corporations through some kind of mutual fund or something, but we begin to reinvest those funds in for-benefit companies, local businesses, cooperatives, and so forth, we have the foundation to fundamentally transform the economy, not only of this country, but of the world. In conversations with quite a few people from the religious and spiritual communities who feel that our institutional churches have pretty much lost sight of their fundamental purpose, which is to be the values regenerators of the society, setting our direction. And a part of this conversation centers on the need to really go do a deep dive examination of our most foundational stories about the nature of the cosmos, of reality, of creation. And one of the themes here that's fascinating to me is as I see it, there are three basic cosmologies in very simple terms. You have the kind of classical, conventional cosmology of the Abrahamic faith, that it's all about an anthropomorphic patriarch in the sky, which tends to lead to the question of, well, gee, the good stuff is in the afterlife, and so how do I get on the good side of the big guy so get a good place in the afterlife? Now, that's not my view of what the original prophets, including Jesus, were really about, which was about justice and cooperation and community in this life. And I'm fascinated in my conversations with people who identify as evangelical or fundamentalist often, that there's a very fascinating division between those who are focused on the idea that the kingdom is in the afterlife versus those who see the kingdom as in this life and is our responsibility during this experience to build that kingdom. Now, the second cosmology that has a lot of energy in our society is the science cosmology, which is the grand machine. It's all just mechanism. There is no consciousness or intelligence, and therefore there's absolutely no purpose to life, whatever. So we just need to distract ourselves with material pleasures or whatever. Then there's a third cosmology, it has many variations, but it is about the idea that all being is a manifestation of integral spirit. And that leads to a deep sense of connection. If you think of it as spirit evolving, seeking to know itself and its possibilities, then that makes us part of an incredible creative spiritual journey. You know, it's not only about, well, that the kingdom is not just a static situation on this earth, it is about a continuing evolutionary search for ever greater possibility and potential and beauty. That leads to a fundamentally different politics. And incidentally, I really got into this back in 1999 when the Seattle Church Council and the Washington Councils put on this event just before the WTO demonstration, where I was on the stage with Marcus Borg, and I've just, his defining statement is ever more stuck in my mind. Tell me your image of God, and I'll tell you your politics.
How do we make the transition from corporate ownership to cooperatives and individuals? If they have all the wealth, how do we begin to make that transfer? I think it's a very large question, and I think that that we can answer it, and we need a lot of work, I think, to get it figured out. I mean, it's a question that as large as the question of global warming. I mean, we understand that at the TELUS Institute, where I am now a fellow, there are a lot of energy experts, and they tell me that we need to reduce energy use 80%, or we need to reduce carbon emissions 80% within 50 years. How on earth are we going to do that? A lot of people are working on it. How many people are working on the transition to a low carbon economy? A lot. We need the same number of people working on this. It's going to take a lot of minds to figure it out. I'll give just a couple of quick thoughts, and I don't think I know all the answers, but I think, number one, I think we need to act, we need to see crisis as opportunity. For example, when the 6 biggest banks in this country were all on the verge of going bankrupt and had to be taken over by the government, we, the people, held those banks in our hands. We could have rechartered them. We could have said, henceforth, you will be a generative company. You will serve the common good. You will have stakeholder representatives on your board. You will cap CEO pay. You will have, thus and so. We could have said whatever we wanted. And then we could have just, spun them back out into the market. We wouldn't have had to hold them forever. We didn't. Again, we don't recognize the power of chartering and ownership design and governance. We could have done that. We may have more opportunities. Crises will keep coming. So I think crisis is one. I think growing the generative economy. One of my friends said to me, he said, it's very difficult to stop the train of capitalism. But what we can do is build an alternative track and hope that more and more people start to move over. And how through, a bunch of messes as we go forward, does the whole thing start to transform? I don't know. I don't think we can say. But I think it actually can. I actually have faith in human nature.
Just one other quick angle on that. As we're building up the alternative, to the extent that we can withdraw all the incredible number of subsidies of all sorts of kinds that make these big corporations profitable, they will collapse.
So it's an interesting question about liquidity. Is it sort of morally superior to have illiquid investments? I mean, do we really want long-term investments that are hard to get out of? Is that really where we're heading? And I think I would say that what we do need to do is bring finance back down to earth. As David was saying, it's up there in the stratosphere somewhere. It's moving too fast and it's too remote, which makes it not able to see. We get our 401k statements. It doesn't tell us, what kind of carnage was created to give us those numbers.
So an interesting addition to the report.
the carnage index. So yeah, we need to bring it back down to earth. Life moves more slowly than finance, and I think that that's probably a good thing. I also I'm very much a pragmatist, and I think that we need different solutions in different settings, and I wouldn't lay down a hard and fast rule. But I'll give an example. I happen to be an investor in Equal Exchange. Equal Exchange is a worker-owned cooperative in Boston. They have preferred shares. Preferred shares are non-voting, and they don't rise in value. So they're different than common stock, which is what we mostly think of. So you get I think I get 5% a year or something. So I put in $10,000, and 10 years from now I'll get back $10,000 plus I get my 5% a year. That's preferred stock. And it was interesting. So when I invested in Equal Exchange, I actually wrote out a check to Equal Exchange and I mailed it to them. What a concept. The money actually reaches the company. About 10 days later, I get a piece of a stock certificate back in the mail. This is how slow things are moving, compared to these nanosecond trading where it's you know, literally millionths of a second.
Explain that, Marjorie. That's one of your primary concepts of divine.
Okay, I'll do that in a second.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, you mean that money actually reaches the company?
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, so let me come back to that one, but I'll just finish with the equal exchange. And then they also sent me a little letter, which was interesting, and they said, as an investor, you agreed to be in this investment for 3 years, at least. And there will be a penalty if you cash out sooner than 3 years. Now, my investment advisor told me, in fact, that they've never really wielded that penalty, but they could. They're managing expectations. I think a lot of what we're talking about with social architecture is you're managing expectations. So I think, and I'm happy to be in equal exchange, you know, for 3 years and maybe more. So yeah, I think we should go slower, but I think there's probably opportunities and legitimate role for other kinds of much more liquid investments. Now, David mentioned, okay, in my book, Divine Right of Capital, I open by saying that that the money that we supposedly invest in companies in the stock market doesn't really reach companies. And people don't understand this. We call it investing. Really, it's speculating because it's the stock market works like a used car market. You know, when you buy a new car, the money goes to, you know, let's say Ford. If you buy a Ford, the money goes to Ford. But in the used car market, the money, you buy a used car, it goes to the previous owner of the car. And then you sell it again, it goes to the previous owner. Well, that's what's happening in the stock market. A company, when they go public, they issue stock, and then the company gets the money, like when Google goes public. But then ever after, that stock is just zipping around, trading hands. And the money that you are investing, you're just giving it to the last holder of the stock. And so it's all secondary market trading. It's more than 99% of investing in the stock market is secondary market trading. And I actually tried to go back and look at some of these numbers. I mean, you know, stockholders put, I forget exactly how I said it, but it's like basically they put a spigot in the side of a company. They, you know, one-time hit of money, and then money is supposed to come out forever. That's really what ownership has become in the stock market. A one-time hit of money, and then your returns go on forever.
With no effort on your part, whatever.
That's right.